This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. Between two-factor authentication, strong passwords, and a VPN, you try to be in control of how your info is protected. But many other places also have it, and they might not be as careful. That's why LifeLock monitors hundreds of millions of data points a second for threats. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit lifelock.com/podcast for 40% off. Terms apply.
This podcast is supported by Progressive, a leader in RV insurance. RVs are for sharing adventures with family, friends, and even your pets. So if you bring your cats and dogs along for the ride, you'll want Progressive RV insurance. They protect your cats and dogs like family by offering up to $1,000 in optional coverage for vet bills in case of an RV accident, making it a great companion for the responsible pet owner who loves to travel. See Progressive's other benefits and more when you quote RV insurance at Progressive.com today. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Pet injury is an additional coverage and subject to policy terms.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Trey Warendorf, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University, and I'm joined today by Justin Holmes, a professor of political science at the University of Northern Iowa. Welcome to the show, my fellow political scientist.
Hey, it's good to be here, Trey.
I mean, neither one of us are like the defender of freedom or his Marxist self, Ken, but I guess we are the rational poli-sci guys.
Hey, there you go. That's rational to a fault, I suppose.
Exactly. You know, my dissertation advisor once told me, Justin, that once you become a scholar, if you're good at it, even your birthday cards sound boring.
You're really selling it for people to stick around past right now.
Exactly.
But,
well, see, here's the fortunate thing. I have never taken off in that world. I have all. That's why I do what I do. I'm too charismatic to be that boring.
there you go.
But be that as it may, on a little note, just want everybody to know that Mike is taking a much needed rest. And so for the next 3 weeks, I'm going to be hosting the shows both with Justin and with Ken. Yes, Ken is back from his vacation as well. And so I'm really excited to be doing you for the next month and be doing this on the show for the next month. That's going to be a lot of fun, and I'm excited about it. So, you know, Justin, it was funny to me, though, that we were going to start because as soon as they got done recording the show last weekend, I kept thinking, oh, there's something that we're going to need to think about carefully for the show.
I sent a text to Mike. I said, "Gosh, have we ever had a topic that was obsolete in a podcast as quickly as around this week?"
Yeah, I mean, 30 seconds later, not literally, but it was close. It was almost 30 seconds.
I mean, the podcast was probably posted about 11 o'clock in the morning, and about 6 hours later,
6 hours later, it was all different. Now,
all different.
As a matter of fact, this issue's so big, we're going to lead with it. Obviously, we're talking about Trump's bombing of Iran. But I will say, and I'm curious, I didn't ask you before the show on purpose for this one. There are different moments in history when, as a political scientist, like the world comes out of the woodwork to ask you questions, right? It's not often, but every now and then it comes. And I don't know if you had noticed this, but TikTok specifically pretty much had a gazillion things going on, arguing that World War III was occurring, nuclear weapons were on the verge of going. I had more phone calls from former students, current students, people who know me from church, family members, basically asking different versions of, should we stockpile water, or not? And this was just a huge issue. So, it's always, are we going to have a draft? Would I be included in the draft? So, this all comes back to the Iran, the Trump and launching missiles in Iran. And I recognize there's big things going on here, but I just wanted to start by saying, if that's been in your feed, take a giant breath. It's all it's going to be okay-ish. No one's getting drafted. No, I don't think nuclear weapons are coming for your house specifically. It's going to be fine. No, don't buy that bottled water, although I know that's too late for several of you who stockpiled before you talked to me. Did you have that experience for this too, Justin, before we get into the details? I'm just curious.
Not for this one so much. Like around election season, I get a lot of that kind of thing. I feel like sometimes it's just people like trying to act like they care about what I do as much as anything. But yeah, I actually, this one, I mean, certainly I've chatted online with friends and things, but I really haven't had, for what it's worth, I mean, I guess the people I know, I mean, the scientific survey of my social media, not happy, but I don't think maybe quite as gloom and doom as your friends. I think
well, and I think that's a function probably of the kind of social media they're using, right? I think this was really a TikTok and by extension, thing. A few days later, an Instagram Reels universe. I don't really think it made it into other channels. So it could
as an old guy, mostly on Facebook. I guess.
Oh, you were old then, man. If all you're doing is Facebook.
I'm old. Yeah. TikTok, I think would be really bad for me. Actually, like
I think it's bad for everybody. Just as a scholar, that's me as a scholarly position for you.
Having used the Facebook Reels a little bit, like it really seems to like induce some sort of ADHD adjacent thing with me, and I think like TikTok, I would lose like 6 hours at a time. I think once I started clicking on things, so it's good. It's good that I've stayed away, but yeah, I guess, since I'm not out in that part of the internet so much, and apparently most of my friends aren't either. I mean, people were pissed off, but like, I don't know that anybody that I know was, kind of hunkered down in the basement or anything like that.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. And I just start with that in part just to say, it is, we live in a fragmented media environment, and it is unique how these different kinds of pieces of it touch on it. So I hope here, one way or the other, whether you're in the Facebook old people camp with Justin and myself, or if you're living in TikTok land with everybody else who's under 23, that we can bring some semblance of rational civil debate to what we think about on this. So let's just kind of go through the timeline.
I am recording this from my basement, so maybe I am paranoid. Although I think it's just where the microphone lives. But,
that could be. I mean, if you weren't there, if you're there not by choice, I suppose. If you'd rather be somewhere else, isn't that the definition of power, right? Like this had power over you if you're in the basement and you wouldn't have chosen so otherwise, right? The famous definition of.
There you go.
Let's kind of get to that timeline. And part of this timeline, we got to wind back to June 13th. Israel began launching airstrikes on Iranian nuclear missile sites, followed by sabotage inside of Iran. And obviously that happened before our last show. But then eventually this past weekend, what we were saying, just about 6 hours after Justin had recorded with Mike, President Trump authorized airstrikes on Iran's 3 major nuclear facilities in an operation called Midnight Hammer. Now, what Midnight Hammer was B-2 stealth bombers dropping, and there's a little bit of question about specifically what they dropped. They might have been, the initial reports is they were dropping what you think of as being bunker buster bombs. Those are bombs that they're designed to kind of, this is a very untechnical way to talk about this, but let's be brief here, right? It's effectively a way to drill deeper and then explode so that you can drop more things on it and in succession have bombs that will blow up deeper and deeper underground, because these sites are deeply fortified and deeply underground, along with Tomahawk missiles launched from subs in combination with that. But regardless of the military technicalities of whether we have actual bunker busters or some kind of other mix, that's what's happening. We have a flurry of bombing from both B-2 stealth bombers and from missiles. President Trump claimed, quote, it completely and totally obliterated, end quote, Iran's nuclear program, while Iran confirmed significant damage to at least 2 of the sites, but insisted in its own state media that no irreversible harm was done. Meanwhile, just hours after the attack, leaked intelligence reports from the Defense Intelligence Agency, or what you're generally going to see online as the DIA, but that's what that stands for, the Defense Intelligence Agency, assessed that the airstrikes only set the program back by months, but did not, in fact, eliminate it, contradicting the earlier claims of President Trump and his top aides. Trump hit back on Truth Social against both CNN and the other leaking institutions that were able then to confirm that report with, quote, the sites that we hit in Iran were totally destroyed and everyone knows it, end quote. After this, Carolyn Levitt argued that the conclusions of the report was wrong, and further, the person who leaked it was, quote, a low-level loser in the intelligence community, end quote. This led the Trump administration to postponing briefings to the House this past week, which has led to consternation from the House, of course. Meanwhile, Trump lashed out at both Iran and Israel and had its own little communication moments when he dropped the F-bomb on live air in an apparent falling out, and also with apparent falling out with Gabbard when it comes to intelligence Senate briefings and additional limited sharing. Now, the truth is complicated in that what actually happened is always difficult to understand when it comes to these kind of battles and the outcome of these battles. And the question of destroying the sites versus destroying highly enriched uranium is difficult to know. Especially since it might have been moved. Further, even the leaked report itself, which came out quickly, is in its own words, quote, a preliminary document, end quote, not a final conclusion. Meanwhile, we have MAGA having a hard time really trying to decide if this was a good or a bad thing. And I think the moment this past week that really sums this up, Justin, was the Cruz Carlson interview. I actually watched almost all of it. I don't know how much you got to see it. It was a heated argument eventually between those two gentlemen, and it's something I think we want to talk about here. And should we view the bombing as as a negative on the president who's promised more peace? And that's a difficult one to really completely ascertain. The Hill did do some polling at the end of this week, and it has a really weird counterintuitive position emerging, at least from the data, which suggests that the more MAGA a Republican, the more likely they are to support the strikes against Iran, and the less MAGA they are, the less likely they are to support the strikes. Now, meanwhile, at the same time, the big question on the left really centers around, can or should the president be able to do this? And for that, Justin, we'll obviously have to get in and talk about the history of post-Vietnam War Powers Resolution in 1973. We can get into that a little bit. But before we get there, I just want to start, here. So much is going on. I've already dropped like 3 or 4 different places you can go with this.
I feel like we've got three shows worth of content right here already.
Yeah, listen, when we were doing this, I kept thinking, oh my heavens, there is going to be a phenomenal supporters exclusive show for this week. I can tell you right now because of all of our Supreme Court cases. But I'll pause this here. I'm going to pause the intro there just to ask you, Justin, what's your initial thoughts on, what has happened, not just obviously last weekend, but the fallout from that?
Yeah, so the fallout I think is kind of interesting. I hadn't seen the poll that you had, but I had another one actually that I had kind of was looking at. So YouGov and The Economist actually had a poll in the field while this happened with the strike in the middle. So it's sort of a natural experiment. And so they don't break out the MAGA versus non-MAGA, but they have kind of Democrats, Republicans, Independents. And what they found was that essentially it was like flipping a switch for Republicans. So unfortunately, they kind of presented it as a graph. So I don't have the exact numbers, but just eyeballing it, Republican support overnight goes from 30 to 70 for strikes against Iran. Independents go up a little bit, and Democrats drop from 25 to like under 5, almost immediately. Which actually I think is exactly the kind of thing that you'd expect in the current kind of environment. So it's a very John Zoller kind of thing. John Zoller wrote literally the book on public opinion back about 35 years ago. And a lot of it's about kind of elite cues where people will, essentially go with kind of leadership that they trust. And so, he's got a lot of these examples, some of which are kind of Vietnam foreign policy things where people polarize, essentially as kind of elites polarize. And so I'm not entirely surprised that Republicans kind of get on board. That's sort of what you'd expect. I think what's interesting here, one thing that largely doesn't exist is your sort of traditional rally around the flag effect. So for a long time, what we've seen in public opinion about foreign policy is that generally speaking, when the president does anything kind of foreign policy related, his approval tends to go up. People tend to kind of pull together, et cetera. 9/11 is the classic example of this, where Bush goes up like 45 points overnight, more or less. But we see this with other things too, not that dramatic, and you don't get that here, at all. And I've kind of argued this with my students for a long time when we talk about that concept. Is that I'm not sure that in kind of a polarized public world that we get that we're in right now, that you're going to get rally effects anymore. I think this dynamic that we're seeing is much more akin, and I don't want to test that with something, just to be clear, I don't want to have another 9/11 to test that hypothesis or something like that.
Well, I mean, you could go back to 1999 in Kosovo with the Clinton air campaign, where he doesn't consult Congress, and he doesn't experience a bump either.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. So I guess you don't always get them, and I think maybe especially in things that are a little more divisive. I think the funny thing is you got one around the Bay of Pigs invasion, which of all things was a complete goat rodeo. But I guess this, and maybe it's different of a kind, but because it's something where there's not a public consensus, I mean, you can lead your own party, but you can't lead, can't really lead anybody else here, especially because there's some choice in the matter, although I think there is with, other things as well, in terms of committing to it. I'm actually not totally surprised with kind of that finding from your poll about kind of the more MAGA you are, the more on board you are.
Well, if it fits the research, it fits exactly what you were saying, because the opinion leader is going to be more Trump in the MAGA circles.
Yeah, you're going to be much more tied to Trump than Tucker Carlson, et cetera. Fred and I kind of did a paper that was sort of inconclusive and bailed on it, but I've always been interested. What happens when somebody says something kind of unexpected in a partisan way? Does that move people, or does that sort of? And I think there's so many contingencies it might be impossible to study. But, what happens to Tucker Carlson now? Does he move people, or does he get ejected? My gut feeling is he gets ejected. And I think the rest of kind of the MAGA universe, I mean, they're largely on board, is the sense that I get. So you're getting, it's not just Trump. I mean, if you are, still on X or things like that, you're going to have Cat Turd, telling you that, hey, this is brilliant. And these, I just love that there's an influencer called Cat Turd. I think you're going to be kind of in this environment where even if you weren't on board before, you're going to be seeing not only is the president on board, but the rest of the administration, a lot of the kind of influential types, et cetera. So I'm not entirely surprised that it moved. There is a degree of Schadenfreude among a lot of us, I suppose. That for the guy who ran that Kamala Harris is going to get your kids killed in a foreign country.
Well, let's even be more honest. I mean, he is the one who repeatedly on Truth Social said, "Just wait, as Biden's polls numbers drop, he's going to bomb Iran."
He said the same thing about Barack Obama in 2011.
Absolutely true. Absolutely true.
Yeah. He's been pushing this kind of wag the dog thing for Oh my God, that's 15 years. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry
So,
to have to recognize how old we are, Justin, but there you did it. You did the math.
oh, that hurts. 14 years, but still, that hurts. At any rate, I think there's a world. I think from having studied public opinion, this doesn't surprise me a whole lot, and it's largely what I expected. I think the only question was, would this be, where would the independents go, and would there be kind of a broader rally effect, which appears to be no. But yeah, I mean, people's opinions on policy are pretty darn malleable, and so I'm not really surprised in what happened here in terms of public support at all.
So now let's move forward then just a little bit. You talked about a little bit on Tucker Carlson, and there is this a little bit still of a split in MAGA, and that interview with Ted Cruz and Tucker Carlson, where the crux of it is the two get into heated debate over both Christianity, Israel's role in Christianity, if any, and then therefore the role of Christianity, Israel, and U.S. foreign policy. Because it's not often. We've had a few moments where there have been these kind of internal MAGA debates, right? And as a matter of fact, we talked about one of them, but ultimately, in that case, like we had predicted, Trump prevails. But in this one, it's not that he's not going to prevail, but the environment of what's going on is slightly different. So
it may not be a universal prevailing. I think kind of Israel policy has always been driven by sort of a series of things. I feel like, and MAGA, I think too, is sort of a series of contradictions, or it's a little. I mean, every American political coalition is a little bit unstable, and you can come to, whether it's the parties or frankly even MAGA, you can get there for different reasons. Right. So to think about kind of the MAGA thing, I mean, I think there's kind of a couple tensions afoot. One is that Trump really has run this. He's very isolationist in general. I mean, that was kind of, I had people asking me. This is where people do ask me stuff. What does Trump mean for kind of Republicans? Back in 2016, and my sense was that in a lot of ways, apart from the rhetoric, policy-wise, he's kind of a bog standard Republican, except when it comes to kind of the orientation towards the international community. So he is not a neocon on foreign affairs, or at least doesn't present as such. He's the only guy that's talking tariffs. Everybody else is free trader. And so I think that was kind of how he pitched a lot of that's what American greatness looks like, is that we're kind of a self-sufficient island, and we're not going to be involved with everybody else's military adventures and things of that nature. On the other hand, I mean, he pretty much flat out said recently that we'll kind of MAGA's whatever I say it is. American greatness is whatever I say it is, and certainly, Iran, however isolationist he wants to be, Iran's a country that the U.S. has had problems with for a long time. I mean, going back to the Reagan administration, it was 83, I think. And
even the contemporary issues that we see stem from Trump over, bailing on the nuclear deal done with President Obama.
Oh, that was my rant last week. Yeah.
Yeah. Listen, we're going to be on a similar page on that one, friend. I listened.
We were largely dealing with it. It's the arsonist putting out the fire on some level, but with this, but I think back in terms of how this fits. I mean, you can have an isolationist streak, but it is hard to kind of walk back that deep-seated distrust among a lot of people, deep-seated dislike, et cetera. I also think within MAGA, like, Israel has kind of a weird position. It's interesting that you brought up kind of the Ted Cruz and Christianity and Israel thing, because I think that's an important part of this story too. But for Israel, we wouldn't be involved right now. That was the spark of all of this. And you get sort of a couple different things. I mean, there is kind of that traditional Republican position that we are perhaps culturally more similar. They are more democratic than anybody else in the region. We're kind of natural allies. You then have kind of that Christian, it's kind of an end times prophecy sort of thing. Not all Christians, but that is certainly out there. That this is about kind of facilitating the second coming, and then beyond that, there is a portion of MAGA that is pretty anti-Semitic. In the other direction, that doesn't want to help them with anything. And so, you've got kind of these three sets of tensions, and I guess you've got kind of two pushing in the direction of, hey, we need to back Israel. We need to back whether it's for religious reasons or cultural reasons or strategic reasons, but then you also do have some pushback where hey, we don't want to be led around by Israel and the Jews writ large, and so I think that's kind of a tension that underlies maybe a little of this as well.
Well, I think that brings us to, I might push a little bit and say that I think Iran having nuclear weapons would be a U.S. foreign policy concern, even if there was no Israel. But you're absolutely right. It heightens the question. Yeah.
I 100% agree. And to be fair, I mean, I'm a little conflicted on this myself. Like a nuclear Iran is not great, to put it, to put it mildly. And just one of my quirks, I say things like that is purposeful understatement a lot of the times. So it wouldn't be ideal for Iran to have nuclear weapons. But I do think, I mean, there was nothing in this that but for the Israel strike, I don't think there was anything that would lead to it happening this week. It's more
that is fair. But which then I think brings us, and then we'll move forward. But that brings us to, I think, one of the big questions from the left has been, well, how dare President Trump usurp Congress's power? And I'll be honest, that made me chuckle a little bit, because this is such an old trope from both sides, right? No matter which president is in power, that's the president who is, pushing the unilateral powers of the presidency. And the truth of the matter is, and I've talked about this in the show ad nauseum as a presidential guy, presidents always push the goes of power. Now, while we might politically disagree with the move or not, what really comes back to is the War Powers Resolution. In the wake of Vietnam, you end up having Congress theoretically wanting to claw some of its war power back, because it effectively ceded most of it to the presidency. As a matter of fact, although the Constitution requires Congress to be the initiator of declarations of war, we haven't done that since World War II. And instead, we have ended up using, under the War Powers Act, what is called an authorization of use of military force. But what effectively this does is it gives presidents the ability to make unilateral actions with U.S. armed forces, but they have to notify Congress 48 hours afterwards, and then they get a 60-day limit, effectively, unless they get a declaration of war or one of those AUMFs, or that authorization military force. And so, this has, again, been since the end of Vietnam. But of course, I mean, not only do you end up having, so for example, Trump will use it a couple of times, but he does notarize Congress. Clinton, I had mentioned it earlier, Kosovo, had not notified Congress. Obama used it for Libya intervention, had not notified Congress. He just said, well, it wasn't really hostilities, so I'm allowed to do it. So again, I recognize that there would be reasons to be concerned about Trump taking these kinds of actions, but they certainly are not outside. Now, again, I would agree that they do not fit our constitutional system, but they don't fit our constitutional system the same way that we've allowed every other president to not fit our constitutional system. I don't think that it's unique in that front, because that does seem to be a big point. So I'm curious, as we finish up on this, what your thoughts about it from that point of view are, Justin.
I think we're very much on the same page. It is. I think it's a problem, but it's not unprecedented,
Yes.
by any stretch. If we go back, I mean, if we're going, let's go back to the 1780s for a minute. If we think about what's in the Constitution and this idea of separation of powers and this concern about not putting too much power in one person, it's pretty clear that, hey, the power to declare war we're going to put that in the legislative branch. The power to conduct war, we're going to largely put in the executive branch.
And it was not
that's
one
a
of those
way
portions of the Constitution where there was no real debate. There was no, I mean, and it's straightforward. Not every portion of the Constitution is straightforward, but it's pretty straightforward.
It's pretty straightforward. I think where there are a couple problems. A series of things. One is that the nature of warfare has changed a lot. I mean, I feel like they could not have conceived of a scenario like this on some level. If you're thinking about kind of what military conflict looks like then, it's a little slower, in a lot of ways. The idea that you could have bombers literally fly out of Missouri and hit Iran and come home, in was it 40-hour round trip or something like that?
Yes, yes.
That's not on the radar of these guys, and so. I feel like the Constitution doesn't deal very well with the kind of world that we find ourselves in a lot of ways, of sort of sub-war military conflict, which is what this, I think, is. I don't know if that's a term, but I'm going to coin that as a term, or if there's a correct term, you can correct me. But we're not at war in a traditional sense with Iran, at least not yet. But at the same time, well, we sure did bomb them, and that sure is war adjacent, war looking. And I do think, I mean, if you go to the War Powers Act of 73, there are some conditions in terms of, what constitutes someplace where the president can act. It's not just anywhere. And the text is, a national emergency created by attack upon the United States, its territories or possessions, or its armed forces. None of which happened here. So that would say, Libya 86, like that would fit nicely into that. That was kind of retaliation for, an attack that killed a couple American troops. On the other hand, this just doesn't meet any of that at all. And I'm inclined to think this is a pretty good standard. I mean, there is, I think within the constitutional system, I mean, there is an idea that, look, we do need somebody that can act unilaterally in cases of emergency. If they are, sailing submarines into up the Hudson River in New York, to bomb it or something. I don't think we want to debate that in Congress. That needs something quick. But this is, doesn't meet any of those conditions. Now, there is some debate. I know, is the War Powers Act itself constitutional? Speaker Johnson said, well, it's just not. It was kind of his take when we talked about debating this. But I think it's a good standard. But of course, the other thing that you rightly point out is so much presidential power is largely based on precedent and what the last guy got away with. And, so it's a general expansion. Once somebody has set the precedent of doing something, subsequent presidents are going to say, okay, the office has that power. And so, we have a long list of these, moments where essentially, the president goes it alone in various degrees of propriety. And so, the next president is going to be, well, what kind of schmuck would I be to not have exercised that power where I see fit, as well. To me, the most egregious of these was probably the Panama invasion under Bush. I mean, that was that was one of the few that kind of reached like close to that commitment time wise and such. But, basically went in and overthrew the government with no congressional authorization or anything, and fairly tenuous national interest connection to the stopping cocaine, I guess. That strikes me as way out of line. This feels a little closer, but at the same time, it doesn't meet those standards. But I guess just in general, I'd really like to see Congress claw some of this back. I've said this, during Obama and drone striking Yemen and things like that. I'm not sure that I have been consistent on this. You'll have to take my word for it, but I don't think it's great in kind of non-emergency situations for presidents to be able to do this. I mean, hell, we had, what was it was like under 36 hours to get a declaration of war in World War II after Pearl Harbor. I think, where there is a genuine need, I think, the government can act without acting unilaterally. And here, just back to something said earlier, there's nothing that said last Saturday was a moment that was an emergency. Again, I don't think a nuclear Iran is a good idea, but on a process level, nothing that happened in there, to my mind, would justify doing this in this way procedurally.
Yeah. Well, and to your last point there about wanting Congress to claw back some powers, and I think we agree on this, but where procedurally I don't think that is likely. I think when you take a look at the scholarship of, like Howell's early works on unilateral presidential power, and then you take a look at kind of the classic works on Congress, like Mayhew have talked about this in the show ad nauseum probably, I think Congress is rewarded for not clawing those back effectively. And so as a result, they continue to love to take positions as opposed to clawing back some of that power. But I'm going to pause us there on that topic, Justin, not because we couldn't talk for another 30 minutes about it, but because,
nobody wants to hear us talk for another 30 minutes about it.
That may not be true. I can't tell you how often listeners are like, could you go on longer? It's like, but would you really want a 3-hour show? I don't think so. We are not.
I could go on for days, but we have other things that happened this week.
Maybe we could do a Joe Rogan version where we're like, listen, it's going to be 8 hours. Who knows, right? And I don't know.
I want to talk about Bigfoot then.
Here, okay, we're going to have just a funny aside for a moment. There are Bigfoot followers in Oklahoma and Texas that actually have my shoe prints as part of their collection of Bigfoot sighting. That is not a joke. That is serious, people, and I am very proud of this. I actually wear Ultra shoes when I hike, which kind of have like extra grippies and stuff in them that look kind of like prints on purpose because that's their shtick. And I was actually hiking with another professor and his wife and my family, and we came across these group of quote unquote researchers who were doing Bigfoot castings for molds. And so we went out, we talked to them for a minute, and then we went on and we came back. And as we were coming back, they were doing more molds. And they're like, look, we found another one. And as we're looking, my buddy is like, that's your shoe print. But he didn't say it out loud. And as we're moving away, we were cracking up. And so, yes, I am proud to say that my shoe prints are part of the collection of Bigfoot memorabilia.
Well, I've never seen you and Bigfoot in the same place at the same time.
Yeah, so that is fair. We could. I could be a Superman.
Could well be Bigfoot.
I could be Bigfoot. So,
all right.
On that hilarious aside. Let's move forward. Yesterday, goodness gracious, Justin, I don't know about you. I knew we were going to get a bunch of Supreme Court cases, right? I knew it was coming. I knew I needed to be ready. And that's one of the reasons I was glad we're recording on Saturday this week. But goodness, I read a lot. I read hundreds and hundreds of pages. Took all of my copious notes. We are not going to get to all of these in the main show. I'm so sorry. So we're going to do Trump versus CASA, and we'll see what else we can get to. But I promise you that in the supporters exclusive show, we're going to get to all of these cases. I did not read all of these cases in detail to not talk about them. But Justin and I both agreed we really wanted to start with Trump versus CASA because this is the birthright citizenship case, which isn't about birthright citizenship, weirdly, in many ways, but it's also about some really important things adjacent to that. So let's get into this one. So the majority, written by Justice Barrett, ends the practice of what is called universal injunctions. And so what that is an injunction that bars a government, in this case the executive branch, from applying some particular order, law, etc., to anyone, and not just the named plaintiffs. Because in normal courses of civil law, what occurs is if you get an injunction, the person who is getting relief in the meantime is only the named plaintiff, right? So if Justin and I have a conflict, and I haven't served him food in the way I ought to, I've violated some law, and he gets an injunction stopping me from doing that for a time being, it only actually applies to Justin, right? Or if there were more people named in the suit. So this issue of universal injunctions, it's been simmering some time. As a matter of fact, Ken and I weighed in on this earlier this year, and unusually enough, there is even a concurrence that specifically deals with what Ken and I talked about. But I'm going to pause on that for a moment. Let's stay here on universal injunctions. So here's the crux of the matter. The Trump administration issued an executive order which redefined the 14th Amendment so that children of non-citizens do not have citizenship because their parents are not, quote, subject to, end quote, the jurisdiction of the United States. So as you might recall, the 14th Amendment allows there to be anybody who is subject to the jurisdiction thereof, they are going to be citizens of the United States. This is something that Ken and I have dealt with in detail on our exclusive supporters exclusive shows, because we've been going through the Constitution. This is a really big heat of argument. Now, the justices did not actually rule on that. Instead, as I've been noting, they've been ruling on this procedural matter of what occurred, because what the district court ended up doing was entering a universal injunction that stopped the Trump administration from enforcing that executive order, not just from the plaintiffs named in the case, but from everybody in the country. And this is something that has happened more recently in historically. We're going to talk about that. So the majority, all six conservative justices, argued that universal injunctions are not sufficiently analogous to any relief available to a court of equity in England or in the early United States, because effectively, and I've talked about this in the show before too, our American political system assumed, we just kind of sucked over the British legal system. We liked that part of of England, and we're just like, we're not going to change that. And so our whole system just assumes that all of those precedents just they're here. Is that a good quick way to put that so far, Justin?
That is, and I've had people yell at me about that. Oh no, we had a revolution, so we made a clean break. It's,
bad news. Not legally, we did. Yeah.
Not legally, we didn't.
Well, in part because we didn't think England was actually following their own legal system, so we wanted to keep what we thought was the right thing. But that's an aside. We'll pause there.
That feels very Declaration of Independence. Yeah.
Oh, doesn't it though? So instead, what they're suggesting is that if you can't find it directly in the Judiciary Act of 1789, which is what informs and creates our courts for the most part, again, see our bonus shows on the Constitution for more about this. And if you can't find it in the Court of Equity in England, it's not going to be permissible. And so instead, the Supreme Court ruled that the only kinds of analogouses we can find benefit the named plaintiff. Now, the dissent disagrees with this, and kind of vehemently, and they take a three-prong attack. One, they argue that the majority is ignoring the larger issue that on the merits, the executive order is unconstitutional, and therefore we don't even need to fuss with all of this. Two, that there is in fact a historical analogous, which is what these things called bills of peace, and they're kind of an antecedent for universal injunctions. And finally, three, that universal injunctions, even if we can't find a specific antecedent, have now been used for about 100 years-ish. There's some historical debate about this, but somewhere in that vicinity. Now, the majority actually comes after the minority's argument on several of these points and forcefully argues that, quote, when a court concludes that the executive branch has acted unlawfully, the answer is not for the court to exceed its power to, end quote. As a matter of fact, they call out the dissent. Barrett calls out the dissent very specifically in saying that they do not understand true legalese and just ignore it. It's a pretty harsh sentiment.
That's one of the nastier things I've seen him put in print.
Yeah, and especially from Barrett, who has historically not had those kinds of moments. And so my takeaway...
No, it feels very Scalia. Yeah.
It does. It feels like a Scalia dissent turned majority, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
And my guess, and again, I've studied a little bit about this because I lived and worked in D.C. for a little bit. I feel like these two justices, I think they got into it in oral arguments. That's what I think. I absolutely think that. But that is absolutely just an assumption on my part based on some evidence. But anyway, we'll put that aside. Trump,
to go back to that though, I think that's pretty interesting. Because there is, a fairly long, or well, at least a recent history of the court being pretty amicable with each other across ideological lines. Scalia and Bader Ginsburg were kind of famously friends. They were almost never on the same side of
went and did operas together regularly.
But, yeah, right. They socialized and things. And I have heard some comments, and I mean, nobody knows that the court is so weird and secretive. I mean, nobody knows exactly what happened, but I have heard some sort of comments and some tea leaf reading that they really are not getting along in the same way that they were. So I think your supposition that there might have been a knockdown drag out during the discussions. That strikes me as very plausible. I mean, it's consistent with other things that I'm seeing is that, not only ideologically do they not get along, but interpersonally,
exactly,
they don't get along in the way that they did, which is, kind of a mirror of Congress as well. But anyway, back to your point.
I'm glad to hear you agree. Trump, I mean, not shockingly, he praised the ruling saying, quote, giant win in the United States Supreme Court on Truth Social. Now, whether or not there is this antecedent, the emergence of nationwide injunctions, I did want to just have a little bit of background here. Everybody agrees that they happened in the 1960s. There's a number of scholars who point to into 1963 as their emergence, but to be clear, those scholars generally are not in favor of nationwide injunctions, and they point to a case where the Court of Appeals in the District of Columbia enjoined the Secretary of Transportation. Other scholars come back much further in American history, and then a few take it all the way back again to 12th century England when government officials have to abide by the law. So there is actually even some scholarly debate about this antecedent question. So, sometimes when you kind of take a look, when you see things like this, you can take a look at the scholarly debate and kind of get a better answer. And in this particular answer, it is, well, there isn't still debate among them as well. Now, before I turn it over to you, Justin, though, it is worth noting, and I paused this earlier on this, one other avenue, and it actually happened this past Friday, just hours after the Supreme Court's decision. The other way to get the basic same kind of action is to have a class action lawsuit. And that's kind of another way to work it around. And that is precisely the issue that Ken and I brought up earlier in the year. However, I noticed and read carefully and with interest that in the second concurring opinion, two justices, including Kavanaugh, clearly put up at least a yellow flag on that front, suggesting they're not keen on the idea of just getting around their ending of nationwide injunctions with a class action lawsuit. But there were only two people who signed on to that particular concurrence. So it's not clear whether that is everybody, how they would, view it or not view it. Justin, what are your thoughts on this case?
This one I find highly problematic. Kind of the decisions yesterday, spoiler alert, not wild about any of them, but this is the one that really irks me. I think, I mean, I think setting aside kind of the longstanding, setting aside kind of the specific history. I mean, we're in a world where we've had a lot of these lately, and certainly the conservatives didn't have, and the court didn't have any issue when everything Biden did got judge shopped down to Texas to get a nationwide injunction against various actions that he took. And full on hypocrisy, I wasn't wild about that when those happened, but I mean that's kind of the world that we live in. And I think to the dissent, I mean the first point there I think is really important, is that this executive order on its face is so ridiculous. I'll just come out and say it. It is so ridiculous as a matter of history, as a matter of procedure, as a matter of what you can do with an EO. I'm not sure why they're not just deciding the case right here. Why they're not. Now we can. There's potentially a debate to be had over, what the 14th Amendment means for immigration and children of immigrants, but we also have the 1893 decision in Wong Kim Ark that essentially sets it up as it is now, that, if you're here, you're here, you're born here, you're a citizen. Now, again, the court could overturn that, but a president can't do that through EO. I mean, that's, just a president can't. It'd be like the president, overturning DCV Heller, through executive order. Like you can't do that. And so to my mind, I mean, there is there's the merits of a case behind this, and kind of why we're farting around in the weeds here with this element of it. I'm frankly pretty confused about. Beyond that, I do think there is. I think Jay and I had talked about this case or something similar at one point earlier in the year. There is a real tension here. I mean, this is, it's our theme today on some level is Federalist 51 style, balance of powers, in terms of who has the authority to do what and such. And there is, I think, a concern. I think there's a legitimate concern about empowering judges to do, sort of too much, especially when it's a judge, versus say the Supreme Court. On the other hand, certainly if we're looking here, I mean, I think the substance of this, and I think, even if there is, kind of this very individualistic tradition in kind of American and English law, this is an issue that has really broad spillover beyond whoever just the plaintiff is. So, I was thinking back as you were kind of talking about the example. I can't promise that there was an injunction, but I remember my dad had a case when he was in private practice before he retired. It was a dispute over a commercial air conditioning unit. And basically falling out between two business partners. And, I would imagine there was probably an injunction at some point in there, like, don't move the air conditioner, and that feels like the court's, sort of understanding of this, or the majority's understanding, is they're very much in the, like, okay, don't move the air conditioner. But it's not a nationwide ban on moving air conditioners. That wouldn't make any sense because, clearly this is about two guys fighting over a piece of business property. But that's very different than what's going on here. I mean, this is something that has very straightforward implications for a large swath of people, whether they've sued or not. We're talking about a fundamental question of rights and statelessness and other things here. And frankly, I think, kind of the small c conservative thing would be to preserve the status quo, while you're hashing out what's happening here. I think it's also, concerning to my mind. I mean, perhaps the class action thing, maybe that's where they should have started. Maybe that's a relief. But, this is impacting a bunch of people who are often not of means to hire a lawyer, certainly not in federal court. Asking every one of them to sue individually, which seems like an implication of this, seems just largely absurd, as a matter of practicality, as a matter of bogging down the federal courts, et cetera. I think the other concern that I have with this, if we're going to have injunctions in some states and not others, which seems to be, kind of the fallout of this, this just sets up chaos on some level, with something that is, fundamental. I mean, we generally resolve, one of the things that gets cases to the Supreme Court, gets them more likely to take it, is when you've got a circuit split where kind of two different federal courts have decided in different ways, on a similar or exactly the same kind of case. And we see that a lot. I mean, that was like, Hobby Lobby was, 26 and 25 or something, at the state court level. And you need to resolve that. Here, they're essentially setting up, granted, these aren't decided yet, but they're essentially setting up this scenario where, if you're born in Massachusetts right now to two immigrant parents, you're a citizen. If you're born in Texas, you're not. They're basically setting up just a giant mess. So I think, there is sort of the legal and historical argument here, which I have to admit I'm not as well versed in as you are by any means. But I think there's also the practical consideration here of, what does this do? And frankly, separating out kind of this theoretical discussion from the practicalities on the ground and the substance of the case, which I feel like what the majority is largely doing here, it just makes kind of a hash of all of this. So, I think, there's an argument for sort of curbing injunctions in some ways. And I think this is kind of the last time that I talked about this, was kind of maybe the position I took. You could set up a system that does curb nationwide injunctions without totally ending them. And frankly, this is a situation where I'd be inclined to let it stay. So.
Well, I'll add my 2 cents and say, I agree with you. I think it's disappointing that the court I think there can, in fact, and I think there is enough debate that the question of what is the utility of nationwide injunctions is an important question. And their existence has certainly shifted in the last 10 years. We've had more in the last 10 years than we almost had combined prior, almost no matter how you slice it up. So
I was not aware, but I'm also not at all surprised.
No. For all kind of political reasons, it's not surprising.
Oh, for sure. Because we've delegated. This is one of my colleague that does our court stuff. One of his gripes is that, we've delegated government power to the courts and executive orders over the last, decade and a half or so.
Absolutely.
You would expect.
He's right.
You would expect. Here I am sticking up for Congress again, but yeah, but no, you would expect to see more of these nationwide injunctions because essentially we've delegated so much power to the executive branch and the judicial branch and they're fighting it out. So yeah. It makes 100% sense.
So I get that we could have that. So I'm sympathetic to Barrett's arguments. However, not in this particular case, because again, here, no matter what you think about the second 2 points of the dissent, their first point, which is this is so bold-facedly unconstitutional as the rest of this simply doesn't warrant analysis. And
why?
Right.
I guess,
why
would you let the president do things that are? Because I think that's the other standard for an injunction. Typically, is there a pretty good chance that you would win?
And nothing stops the court here from overstepping and simply saying, "Hey, on a different, here's what we rule about injunctions." But by the way, no, this is, this doesn't fit the 14th Amendment. We're done. And so I wrestled yesterday thinking about it. So my one maybe unique takeaway here, Justin, is I wonder if, one view is going to be the Ken view, right? I can hear Ken always in my head because we've done this enough, saying they're all corrupt. Well, the 6 conservatives are all corrupt. Of course, they were corrupt for Trump, right? And again, we'll put that kind of aside for a second. The another possibility is, Barrett spends some significant time talking about Marbury v. Madison as an example of where the court says that something ought to be away but doesn't do it, and that's another area where she disagrees with the dissent. But historically speaking, as political scientists, we know that the other reason that John Marshall, who is the author of Marbury v. Madison, one of the reasons he rules the way that he does is he recognizes that it's very unlikely that in that case, President Jefferson, will end up adhering to his order, and so he worries about the court's power. I can't help but wonder if the other reason for punting is a worry, at least among some of the justices in the majority, that if they had ruled differently, that this might in fact be a case where Trump went, no. And so as a result would then harm the court more than clawing slightly back some power and giving Trump a win. What's your thought about that?
Gosh, I really like that comparison, actually. Because I mean, that's again, I like that we're thinking in these sort of balance of power and also the practicalities. Is that the court is what was it Hamilton in the Federalist Papers that they are by definition the weakest branch. They don't have the
least dangerous branch, as he put it.
Least dangerous branch, yes. And they don't have the power of the purse, and they don't have the power of the military, and so and I think that has been a problem historically, is that they are essentially dependent on the other branches following their decisions. And it's actually shocking that it's worked as well as it has, to be honest. But yeah, I mean, that's absolutely the Marbury v. Madison story. I'd really like to know what Marbury's deal was that they were so adamant about not giving him a job, that you'd risk that if he had a bad personality or what, but that they're willing to, kind of go to the mat over the guy. But we've seen this at other times. There was the famous Jackson, the courts made their decision. Now let's see them come enforce it. And so, we have historical precedent going, well, back to close to the beginning about this. I could see this, I think there are probably a lot of things going on, here. I mean, this is certainly kind of armchair quarterbacking it a little bit, but, I do think, I mean, I think there are a couple justices where Ken is probably right. I don't think it's all the conservatives, but I do sort of think that like Alito and Thomas are kind of like, Trump can do whatever he wants, and that's our jurisprudence, to some extent. I think that there are some others in the middle, and because as you're talking, my first thought was, God, that sounds a lot like a John Roberts kind of thing, where he is, he might sort of do something like that. Again, I don't know the guy, but it does certainly have that feeling that, are we, where do we pick our battles? Do we want this to be the confrontation? Because, I mean, at some point, Trump has been, certainly the administration has been sort of defying the courts in a lot of the immigration stuff, in terms of, moving people around and not.
It's the most popular politically when you take a look at polling data.
Yeah, and so, although less so than it was, but he hasn't yet completely defied the Supreme Court, but I don't know why he wouldn't, to be honest.
Well, on that very optimistic thought, since we have two more cases to cover and other things, I'm actually going to pause this, and I'm so sorry, but
no, that's all right.
Yeah, because we got to save something for our midweek show. When I say something, I mean a lot. So this week, we've got a couple of court cases to hit. We're going to be taking on Mahmoud versus Taylor. We're going to take on the Free Speech Coalition versus Paxson. We're going to talk about the Democratic primary for New York. And I don't know, we're going to be trying to take on some questions too. We got a bunch of questions coming in, if not this week, next week, and the week after that. We've got just a packed supporters exclusive show. And so what that means, if you'd like to be able to get that midweek supporters exclusive show, you've got to be a supporter of the Politics Guys. And it's really easy to do if you just head to the show notes, pop your phone out for 2 seconds. You'll see you can click right there and you can become a supporter. You can also do it by heading to politicsguys.com/support. Or, of course, you can head again easily to our website at politicsguys.com/support, or you can just head down there in the show notes, click on it. It is so quick. It is so easy. Different kind of Patreon plans there to get you set up. It just takes a couple of minutes to make that happen. You can also always reach us at mail@politicsguys.com if you have a question, or if you're not in a financial position to support the show, but you'd like to hear those bonus shows. You get all other kinds of things as well, like access to Discord. But again, I will let you go ahead and click there and do that yourself. I will ask you, if you've liked the show with myself and with Justin, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review us. We need those algorithms. We need to take down TikTok's World War III things and put us up at the top of TikTok. So make that happen now.
We could pass Joe Rogan if you like and support
exactly.
us enough.
That would be the greatest thing ever. I don't like him. So
I just want his money.
Well, I was not ready. So here's the answer. Please become a supporter of this Politics Guys so that Justin and I can have more money and quit our day jobs and support you guys full time. That's what I'm hearing here. I would happily do that, actually. But we would need a lot more supporters, people. I'm just saying, let's be honest. You need to rope in your like rich Uncle Joe into supporting the show for that one. I do want to say, though, that there are some people who really do try to make that possible, and that is our executive producers. They're amazing. Like, I love chatting with them. They get access to us on things like Slack, and I just love that. So let me list them out. And as a matter of fact, I want to apologize. I had missed a name last time I did the show. I'm so sorry. So here we go. We've got Wilma Marino, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, and Brian Matza. Thank you all so much, because they're the people trying to make that a possibility, and I really appreciate it. So let's keep making that executive producers line longer and longer, because I love it. I will see you guys here for the bonus show, or next week for our next full-length episode. I hope you'll join us then.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,